Well, we just got a good market signal, I think, on the poll there, and I think I would agree with sort of the rankings that people came out with today, but we'll see at the end of the panel where we sit. You've heard a lot of the topics that we're going to dive into in this panel at a high level. The good news for us and for those of us who have been working on driving innovation in the industry is that it's now a top-line issue. So you heard in many of the view from the C-suite panels about the challenges of transforming the enterprise, keeping pace with the market, the imperative that they have to move. You heard, I think one CEO had mentioned he spends about 55% on maintaining the enterprise, 45% on building the next generation of the enterprise, and he'd love to switch that. You've heard, again, more and more people focused on making a order of magnitude change in the efficiency and the effectiveness of our industry. So with this panel, we're going to dive into that next layer, I think, of how are we going to do that. And we have a great set of different dimensions of the challenge here. So we have some leading organizations that have diverse lines of business that are working on thinking about that next product mix. We have one of the great technology innovators and leaders around the world who's been harnessing and developing AI for the next generation. And we have somebody who's made sure or works every day to make sure that our industry has the ability to, the regulatory framework to try and pursue this innovation. So with that, I thought we'd just give a little bit of an opening flavor of how your organizations and your work is driving innovation in the industry. So with that, maybe Rebecca, if we could start with you.
Well, I'm very glad with the poll result because I think one of the challenges of sitting up here on a panel and talking about innovation is how rapidly it changes. I don't know how many of you are aware that FSB came out with another report last night on decentralized financial technologies. From my lens, the sort of current state of play for financial institutions is that we have to continuously collaborate with our clients, global and local regulators, small and medium-sized innovation community, sometimes that's referred to as the fintech community, and the largest global technology platforms. And this is in order to create the products and services which meet the needs of the modern financial market participants. We focus very heavily on our innovation journey at BNY Mellon, on our employees, very squarely with our clients, our operations, and our product suite. Just in 2014, we opened our first innovation center, and we thought that innovation meant that it was a cool space with techie people where we could wow our clients. Our thinking has very much evolved over the last while to understanding that innovation is really a continuous process that every employee needs to bring to work every day, and we embed that pretty regularly in the collaboration that we do both internally and externally.
Great. Gurjit, if you could give a little background on where you came from and how you came to work with this industry and what you've built at Yazdi.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is I'm a mathematician and a computer scientist. We started working on an area of machine learning called unsupervised machine learning back at Stanford. And the key idea was as we keep generating more and larger amounts of data, our ability to ask questions in that data rapidly deteriorates. So we were building technologies to go work with that. And the US government, which had funded the research, basically asked us to commercialize it. We initially started in the healthcare industry in problems, all the way from drug discovery to, health insurance and care delivery in the US healthcare systems. And then eventually we found our way in financial services. And so by dint of our work with financial services, I've interacted a lot with innovation groups, because if you work in the area of AI and machine learning, it used to be super innovative 2 or 3 years ago before all the CEOs started talking about it. And so I got to interact with a lot of the innovation groups. And, thereafter we focused on some pretty complicated problems in financial services, all the way from financial crimes and money laundering type of situations to regulatory risk modeling and delinquency management and insider risk. And I think the one sort of key observation that I've taken in our work with financial services is, it's an environment that's rich and replete with data, and it's really important to manage data very, very well. So I think that is kind of the key innovative thing that needs to happen next in financial services is that we need to start thinking about the data as an asset, and we have to start managing it as a product. And again, I think I'm happy to continue talking about it as the panel progresses.
Great. And Tanizaki-san, you've been driving innovation at SMBC for many years. You've been very engaged in our work at the IIF. A little flavor of what's a priority and how you're delivering on this at your organization.
Yeah, thank you. When we try to pursue innovation, we emphasize that our capabilities are closely linked with the core values, which are trust and credit. Based on this trust and credit, we are working to enhance ecosystem by using our networking, including startups and large corporations and so on. In this, our ecosystem, we are inviting various players such as AI ventures and the data analysts, startups, and large corporations in our ecosystems. This ecosystem has already started to give birth to new businesses for us. Regarding our offerings, offerings to the market, offerings to the customers, offerings to the institutions, our digitalization is a center pillar in our midterm plans. Specifically, we are focusing on 4 pillars for this digitalization strategies. One is just enhancement of customer experience. Second is creation of new businesses. Third is improving productivity and efficiency. And fourth is advancement of management infrastructure. Especially currently, in order to create new businesses, we are focused on developing platform business. So we have already started several new business. As we will see, we will believe that there is a good potential for growth in these areas. In addition, outside Japan for overseas, we are strongly promoting financial inclusion through digitalization. For example, in Indonesia, our subsidiary bank, Bank BTPN, the 10th largest bank in Indonesia, is already offering mobile-based banking for unbanked people.
And Zia, I think some of that would probably resonate with you, and maybe a little story about Lumen Labs and your expanding role and the role of innovation at MetLife.
Yeah, it certainly does. I think we have a choice in terms of all the things you could do to pursue innovation today. And we've made the choice to do 3 things. As many of you have mentioned, maybe the mindset shift or the culture change is one of the most important of them all. If you ask C-level people what's going to affect the total shareholder return over the decade, they always point to that. How do we make our culture more adaptive in terms of its strategy, as well as how do you make it more customer-centric? The second thing is externalizing the company more. I think Hirano-san mentioned it in the last session as well. How do we do things not just inside the company, but with partners? With the VC community, we have a digital ventures group. Through the venture capital community, we're partly an investor in Ayasti. But more importantly, how do we solve known business challenges today by inviting insurtechs to collaborate with us on things that we could do? And I'll share some of those stories a little bit later, Conan.
Yeah.
The third thing is just simply we build things. And one of the things that we've built helps us maybe reimagine what insurance might look like in the future.
Excellent. And one of the things that you mentioned there was customer-centric design. Yeah. And I think that's a really important development. You know, digital transformation of the industry, taking the products and services that we have today and digitizing them so, again, they can be more responsive, more resilient, more efficient, more effective. That's a really important development in the industry that we'll keep talking about. But technology is also disrupting how our customer bases and society is interacting. So it also gives us a chance to really rethink what are those products and services that we're delivering. And so maybe if you could start off with a thought about how you're delivering and driving customer-centric solutions.
Sure, thanks, Conan. We did some original research on what the customer of the future is looking for. So 4 or 5 years out in 2023, what are the brands of the future going to be doing successfully in order to reach those customers? And while there's a variety of different trends that we published, there are 2 that I'd highlight for this audience here today. They're quite simple. The first is experience is everything. Obviously, we've said the consumer expectations are rising, but fundamentally, the experience that you deliver is the value that is perceived, and making sure that that experience is frictionless, instantaneous, and contextual is incredibly important. The second, which is more of a new trend, is the idea around trust. Trust and risk are fluid. And we've seen from companies like GrabPay in Indonesia and Gojek in the Southeast Asia, trust and risk are fluid in that the boundaries between industries are changing. Consumers trust the last company that delivered them value, independent of whether or not they really are a bank or an insurance company. But that trust is provisionally given these days. It's not given in a blanket permission forever. It's provisionally, transitionally given in order to achieve one thing. And therefore, the scandals and the issues that we have around trust have made its way into the consumer psyche, and therefore you need to really manage trust very carefully when it's given.
And I think, maybe Gurjeet, a word, people might not think of customer-centric solutions when they think of a Yazdi because you think of solving big problems on the back end. But what you're building really allows people to transform how they're interfacing with their customers on the front end. Do you have some thoughts of how you've seen that evolve and develop with the IF members that you're working with?
Yeah, absolutely. So, on the whole area of trust, when you're using machine learning and AI, you can very quickly get into a situation where you build models that are too complicated, where the users of the models don't understand, the people who are affected by the models don't understand. And so explainability and trust are central to artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I think sort of onwards with the theme of innovation, I think this is sort of where a lot of emphasis needs to be placed going forward, because a lot of our lives are already run by models. And it's important to understand where they work well, where they don't work well, and how do we diagnose them. And so in particular, I have 3 basic ideas there, which I think are worth exploring, and then I can give you a few sort of real-life examples of those ideas. The first idea is that we need to sort of make the machine learning and AI models separate from their understanding. So lots of financial services organizations today try and do this by independent model validation groups, right, where you try and recreate the models in an independent way. That is a good first step, but it still relies on you sort of buying into the idea that the data was free of the bias, or in other words, it included the bias that you intended for it to include. And that may not be the case. The second idea is atomicity of trust. Atomicity means that for every decision that comes out of a model, we have to be able to justify that exact precise decision, not just the entirety of the model. And so I believe that's sort of key to it. And then the third major idea is the user experience. As Zia was mentioning, trust is really important, and building trust relies a lot on the experience of the user. Now, in this case, I'm not talking about the experience of the end customer. I'm talking about the experience of a user inside a financial services institute, maybe a financial crimes investigator or a model building functionality. But the user experience is really critical. Let me wrap up by one quick example, a concrete example. A lot of our work centers in financial crimes and anti-money laundering, where the statistic is that a large bank employs thousands of people to investigate transactions, and about 98% of the transactions do not result in a suspicious activity report. From a machine learning perspective, you can absolutely crush this problem, because if you just blindly guess that nothing is going to be suspicious, you win by default. And so this is where sort of this idea of being able to build complicated models, but then being able to explain it using independent and simple rules that can go into production and can get regulatory approval is really what makes these systems sing and eventually result in reducing investigative volumes dramatically, while ensuring that nothing that was suspicious in the past stops being suspicious.
Rebecca, I think you had some thoughts about customer-centric approaches as well.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear an AI professional talk about the built-in biases, because I think this is a critical aspect of, as we sort of exit from the human touch and a diversity of stakeholders into a completely different world. And so having that front and center in the discussion, having the right people do the evaluation, making sure they're coming from a diversity of perspectives, cultures, genders, and personal experience is going to be absolutely essential to the outcomes. On the trust piece, again, this is an incredibly important aspect. We're a 235-year-old company. We've built up a long track record of trust. Some of our peers in the new economy are 20 years old, and they have great customer experience. But over the long haul, cycle after cycle, how many of them are going to be there for the long haul for their customers, et cetera. And so, the trust also comes with the ability to deal with important risks, and especially in the financial crime space, which you were just mentioning. I think we do need newer and better tools to address this problem. By the same token, the regulatory community and the law enforcement community has put this responsibility squarely on the shoulders of the financial institutions. And so we have to manage, yes, there are better and quicker tools to do this, but ultimately we're responsible for the outcomes. And so that I think we're going to enter this space very cautiously. So it's great to have partners who are developing better methodologies, but we also have to have the regulatory community come along with the journey with us so that we can get more efficiency and better outcomes in this space.
And that, I think, brings us back to a question that was in the poll before of culture, really changing the mindset, changing how institutions are engaging with each other, changing the framework between the public sector and private sector. And Tanizaki-san, I know that changing that corporate culture has been part of what you've been focused on in your work. So could you share with us some ideas and hopefully success stories of how you're driving changes in the culture at SMBC?
Yes, just regarding our digitalization, I believe that most important thing is change of staff's mindset and change of the corporate culture itself. Of course, we have many staffs who are excellent in design and design thinking, but ideally, all the staff should have design skills in order to change and redesign the existing service and products. For such a change, open innovation plays an important role, I think. Everyone already knows that open innovation is for promoting new business, but I think it is also very useful for changing the corporate culture itself. And in Japan, we, SMBC, opened the open innovation facility, Hoops Link Tokyo in Shibuya. And this Hoops Link Tokyo is a place for collaboration among industry, government, startups, ventures, and large tech companies. They meet there and discuss business ideas, and events and workshops being held almost every day. Our staff is also joining this discussion and the events to find new business opportunities. One thing I want to mention here is that open innovation in Japan does not always mean cooperation only with startups. Open innovation also includes collaboration among large tech companies and our companies. So instead of learning accelerator program just for startups, we regularly hold a workshop program named SMBC Brewery, and where the large corporations and startups bring up their issues, their pain points, their programs for sake of creating new businesses.
Excellent. And for many very good reasons, we're an industry that has always focused on risk and managing risk, and that's a core competency for us. But that is, of course, a great challenge when you try and say, rapid change, now let's be really innovative and totally rethink what we can deliver given our strengths and our platform and what our future economy needs. And I know, Zia, you've kind of straddled that world for a while now, so maybe some thoughts and examples of how you've driven and changed the approach and the corporate culture.
Yeah, only 5 years ago I was in the software industry. I spent 20 years doing that. And now that I'm in insurance, I think we realized that we want to focus the culture change around two things. And I think you've all mentioned it. The first is the idea of an adaptive culture. Test and learn. We've launched about 60 different experiments or projects, and 14 have been commercialized. We need to be more comfortable with taking risks and different ways of thinking about what is a stage gate way of checking to see whether or not a innovation is working. And that element of having an adaptive strategy means that you're going to have to unlearn and relearn new ways of thinking. That ties to design thinking and agile, which we're embedding not just in our organization, but in our ecosystem, with our bank partners, with our superannuation fund customers in Australia, with everyone. Because you can never innovate faster than the market. The second point, of course, is client centricity. We have to make sure that we put the customer at the heart of everything that we do, design for it, and build experiences that are completely frictionless if possible. I'll talk about one later on.
Excellent. And we've started to have some questions come into the app, so just a reminder, get your questions in, and we look forward to moving into some of these shortly. But before we do that, there are a few technologies that have driven change and innovation in the industry a little more than some others, and AI is certainly at the top of that list. We at the IIF have done a number of studies and papers looking at the role of AI and how AI and machine learning are being developed and applied in our industry. And Gurjeet, I thought maybe if you could just start with some of the principles that you've built your solutions with, and then some examples of the impact that they have.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are these 4 or 5 principles that we've discovered in working with, with our partner banks. Because what happens with AI and machine learning is it fundamentally relies on the data. And so oftentimes there are lots and lots of reasons for not to pursue something using AI and machine learning. And many of those are, at the end of the day, not really all that useful. So the first thing, is what happens if the data is bad. And I think it is a property of data to be bad in general. So like hoping to have perfect and clean data sets isn't really a realistic expectation. In 100% of my experience, I've learned that anytime you think the data is bad, it actually turns out there is still something valuable in it that's, it's valuable to extract out of it. The second thing is running an apples-to-apples comparison. And again, what happens with sort of trying to automate our processes using AI and machine learning is, you already have a process in place in many cases. And so in many cases, the AI-based solution is not held to the same standard as the solution in place already. So it's important to run an apples-to-apples comparison. As we've already spoken about, I think trust and explainability are fundamentally important. And one major part of that trust is user experience. At the end of the day, you want to leverage the domain experts that you have, and you want to sort of use the knowledge that they have and empower them with tools that sort of are a very good combination of their ability and automation. And then finally, as Zia was mentioning, the rate of failure is really something that you have to be comfortable with, because in many cases, you might want to automate a process, but the data might not have the signal. And so in some cases, it will fail, and it's not just because it was bad technology, it's just the data didn't have what you were looking for. And I think this sort of brings me to this idea of data product management. I think this is really something that's a big impediment to utilizing AI and machine learning as it stands today, is that we don't think of data in large enterprises as an asset. We think of it as a liability. What you see in large technology companies is you have specific roles, personnel, right, whose job is to sort of manage the data, make sure that that you document where it is and how quickly it's being updated, because the serendipity is really what you're after. When data collected for a purpose, it actually ends up being useful for something entirely different. And so I think managing data as a product is really key there as well.
So Zia, it seems that you've got some thoughts on this topic as well.
Yeah, just to get practical for the audience, I think we use ML or AI, machine learning and AI, in at least half, if not the majority of the things that we're doing that are innovative. It's embedded everywhere. You don't have to call it AI, ML. It's just the way in which intelligence is everywhere in the business. And I'll give you some examples from the back to front. So in the back end, airline systems have been using yield management for a long time in order to optimize pricing. The insurance industry is being clever about ways in which it can optimize how it might price a particular product and eliminate or change the workflow associated with it. We talked about waste and fraud detection. We're able to triple or quadruple by using pattern recognition, ways in which we could improve the quality of the claims. In the middle office and the front office, I like to talk about health. Health is, at the end of the day, the flip side of life insurance, and in many ways the job to be done for many of our customers. If there are things that we could do around what we call 360 health to increase the health span of our customers, by using data and thinking about ways not just around underwriting, but ways in which we could make better predictions around screening and diagnosis tools to elongate both the quality of the life as well as to reduce claims, it has a massive impact. And finally, around inclusion, we use data to help with better understanding of financial awareness and financial health across the world. In places like Bangladesh, we use comic strips to understand and to explain the time value of money or the advantages of insurance, all the way to more sophisticated tools to help people better use technology in order to make better financial decisions. I think AI, ML, and eventually blockchain will be a part of everything.
Excellent. And Tanizaki-san, I think that you're building AI solutions in fraud prevention and applying them in other areas of the enterprise as well. Some examples for the audience?
Yes, just we have already started AI services. Just 5 years ago, we have already started for the customers. We are using as contact center, work call centers. And actually, we fully understand the AI-related issue, such as incompatibility of AI and explainability. So here I would like to talk about AI from a different angle, that of ethics. The runaway AI is a hot topic globally, so it is very reasonable that people fear the runaway of AI. So we made AI implementation guidelines as our ethics 2 years ago. So the guidelines show proper implementation, proper planning, and proper management of AI, as well as necessary measures for AI projects.
Excellent. And Rebecca, AI really relies on data and access to data, and data is a key issue. It will be on the agenda at the G20, where free flow of data is something that will be discussed. And so the legal framework for how we can access, use data is a key element. Any thoughts or comments on the framework that's evolved and key issues that we'd like to see change, maybe?
So one of the opportunities and challenges is that there hasn't been a global rule set or interoperability of the rule sets that exist across jurisdictions. There are 38 different jurisdictions that have regulations or laws or rules on the books that directly affect our business. So if we look across the span of how do we operationalize some of the great work that's being done to deliver new products and services to our clients, we have to be keenly aware of the regulatory expectations in every one of the local markets in which we're participating. And even if we're not physically in those markets where our clients are domiciled. So we look at it sort of in three major buckets. So first, there is the regulations looking into data flows, whether those are domestic, the way we store and keep data in market, or how we transmit it across borders. The second bucket is around privacy. This is probably one of the most important aspects, and it goes into the idea of trust. It also goes into the idea of sort of operationalizing data as an asset class, as was discussed earlier. I think the privacy concerns are very real from our customers' lens as well as our regulatory lens. And lastly, the whole idea of protecting data. So that falls into a bucket which what I would consider security. So whether that's cybersecurity, fraud protection, or even up to the level of national security. And this is where it gets the most complicated, and we heard in the previous panel around the geopolitics. And so having an open and constructive intergovernmental dialogue around data security, I think it should be at the top of the agenda, and we really applaud Japan for taking significant leadership in this regard. Having this take place at the G20, having governments, have this embedded in the communique so that it's a point of discussion is a really critical step, and Japan has worked really tirelessly to bring that to the top of the global agenda. That being said, I do want to sort of address where the regulators have significantly made progress in terms of cooperation. We're seeing it in whether it was mentioned earlier in this panel and in the previous panel around the GFRIN, which is this global initiative to have technology innovation with cross-border impacts co-curated within a global environment. And so that gives international financial companies a real good spot to come into a safe environment and try to embed this view of being able to fail safely, and better our product classes. There's also been enormous regulatory bilateral cooperation. I think the UK, Australia, Singapore, and increasingly Japan have been incredible leaders in upskilling and providing a joint capacity building sort of ethos in cross-border regulatory cooperation. We've seen the impact significantly in Asia, but I think as it gets to the global agenda, we're going to start to see the US and China potentially being able to grapple with some of these issues as well. Lastly, I'd sort of like to pivot to the China story because, I think this is the first international conference I've been to in a very long time where China participants and China issues have been front and center. the amount of innovation and technological products that are being developed in China, I think, is incredibly important. And if you look at some of the issues that have been discussed across the days of this conference, which are legacy systems, speed, customer demand, et cetera, China has been able to leapfrog a lot of the challenges that the Western Hemisphere has faced in terms of bringing really good ideas to market. And so it's great to have the China voice into the discussion so that we can learn, leverage, and collaborate across this really, really important market.
And I think a lot of things to dive into there. One, data policy and the operating environment for our industry is something that's absolutely critical moving forward, and we see some challenges evolving as data policy might be different across industry sectors. We have a number of different regulators, so regulatory mandate overlap is something that we need to work through, and it's essential because, again, this is the source and driver of so much of the new product services and improvements that customers and governments and companies are coming to expect.
And just on that point, thank you for raising it. I think one of the other interesting outcomes of the regulatory dialogue that we have consistently across our borders is the new focus and importance, and I think all of our panelists have mentioned this, is around data governance. Data governance and how do we put the internal frameworks around how do we use, manage, store, and share data front and center of our regulatory obligations. And I think that is going to provide us the tools to communicate our goals and aspirations in this space to the regulatory community and where they can hold us accountable.
Right. And you had also brought up China before, and I think that the China story of the total digital lifestyle and mobile-based commerce is now, of course, very well understood around the world. But something that I think is starting to come out in this conference a little bit is the pace of change in products and services. So at our IF Future Leaders meeting in Shanghai this week, there's a story of in a time that a Western wealth management company developed 2 products. A Chinese competitor had developed 37 different new products, and 4 or 5 of those took off and scaled. But again, that pace of change, having the tech stack to deliver that speed, and this was in a very compressed time period. So Zia, maybe if we could pivot back to you on some of the different services and products that you're building and delivering based on these new technologies. Blockchain technology is another one that people have really tested and experimented with over the past several years, and some things are starting to move into production, and I think you've got an exciting example there that you might be able to share with us.
Great. We think that it's good to experiment with a variety of different technologies. In insurance, we were one of the first to use virtual reality 2 or 3 years ago, and it had a plus 95 NPS. And then about 2.5 years ago, we started a conversation with MAS in Singapore about, well, what if we were to try to do something using blockchain and distributed ledger? And we're happy to say that it was one of the world's first, if not the first, way of using health and life insurance over distributed ledger. And let me very briefly spell it out, because it's an interesting use case that has an inclusion angle as well. For women who are pregnant in Singapore, there's a risk of gestational diabetes, about 1 in 5, and it's somewhat indiscriminate of BMI and other factors. In other words, it could happen to anyone. If we offer insurance on the spot in a somewhat frictionless experience, under 2 minutes or less, for about $60 US, we can cover that woman against a risk for which she is not necessarily covered. Fast forward about 20 weeks later, 25th week of her pregnancy, she goes to the doctor's office and registers a test. It's called an oral glucose tolerance test. Maybe some of you have had that, where you determine whether or not you actually have gestational diabetes. At that moment, it's where the magic happens. The nurse will write onto the blockchain either a 0 or a 1. When it's a 0, that means she doesn't have diabetes, nothing happens, everybody's happy. But when it's a 1, that oracle is a trigger that basically executes the smart contract feature. And then everybody, including the regulator, knows at that moment in time the fact, the truth. There's no trust cost associated with traditional distributed systems. At that moment, we pay. There's no claim. The customer doesn't have to make a claim because we already know directly from the report that indeed she's due 500 Singapore dollars. And why this is interesting, and Christine Lagarde mentioned this to me at the last IIF meetings, is because of the potential to through much lower costs, include more and more risk pools and more at-risk population, women, the elderly, people at the middle and the bottom of the pyramid, to provide insurance that's easier, simpler, and so much less costly so that it could proliferate the number of use cases. Of course, the gearheads love the fact that this was distributed ledger, working with real customers, and it was in the sandbox, and fundamentally, it's claimless, which makes maybe a peek into what might be the future of what insurance could be.
And I think that's the key, is it was really focused on transforming the user experience at what can be, a difficult time, and really having the transaction and the filing all melt to the background and have that be automated. And I think that that's a powerful story. You mentioned something else, which is financial inclusion and using technology to change the equation, bring more people into the formal mainstream system, be it SMEs or individuals. And I didn't know if anybody else on the panel wanted to talk about how technology is really driving inclusion of gender, other sectors that have been underserved maybe by our industry in the past.
Well, I was really moved by Kathy Matsui's metrics yesterday, saying how far Japan has moved the dial in terms of bringing women into the formal economy. I think if we look across the world at the SME sector, the majority of small businesses are female-owned, and this is a place where technology has a great promise. If we can bring the innovative tools, experiences, the digital efficiencies, and we can fix some of the cross-border challenges, we can have every small woman-owned business be a global business. And there's something incredibly powerful about that, especially if you're dealing with very serious structural issues within your economy. This is, again, a way that you can just leapfrog some of the barriers to getting women empowered and financially included.
And Tanizaki-san, I think I've seen that as a theme across many of your initiatives as well, as just serving a broader swath of the economy, be it small businesses or individuals, in the work that you've done.
Yes, just I want to talk about the digital identity. Just with the increase in digital transaction, the need for identity verification will further increase. On the other hand, it is definitely troublesome because the user must remember his old ID and passwords. According to our survey, Japanese people have at least 15 to 20 sets of ID and passwords per person for mobile users. But in fact, they easily forget their combinations. And to improve matters, we are focusing on biometrics. We set up a new companies under the regulation of the Japanese Banking Act. This was set up 2 years ago. We called Polarify. Using this Polarify's product, we can use the biometric authentication. So user identification by voice and by face or by fingerprints eliminates the necessity to store ID and password. I want to create a world where there is no need for a password because you are the password. So I personally think digital identity is a good business opportunity for us. So financial institutions will always have to spend much money on identity verification system to improve both convenience and securities. So by using this product, it's possible for many financial institutions or corporate entities to introduce identity verification systems more easily than developing something in-house. So anyway, I believe that there is strong needs or demand for this kind of product.
And digital identity is one of those areas where a lot of the issues that we've talked about and a lot of the technologies intersect. And it's also a place where, as you mentioned, proving identity, authenticating identity, maintaining somebody's identity, this has been a cost of doing business, and maybe rethinking this as sort of a core competency of the industry, and maybe a place where people and consumers see value. Again, I like to think sometimes that if banks became a genius bar to help you manage your digital identity and security in the industry, that's a pretty good way to maintain a customer relationship in an age when transactions and payments and other things are sort of melting to the background. But I know, Zia, you in your work have taken a very white sheet of paper approach to rethinking the products and services that you've built out. Did some things things in digital identity and new services that the industry could provide resonate with you as well?
They do, because digital identity for us is about access. It's about the people who do not have an identity, do not have documentation that's digital, and therefore either cannot access the system or are underserved. If you don't have the proper type of credit history, for example, then you're at a huge disadvantage compared to others. And the same goes with our industry and insurance as well. Therefore, in order to serve the underserved, we think that digital identity plays an important role, in particular amongst certain communities. I'll reinstate the idea of women, as you did, and in particular salaried women in emerging Asia. They have jobs and they have roles, but they don't participate as equally in many conversations about finance and insurance as they should. Secondly, will be people at the bottom of the pyramid who need more information about the future of their financial health. And then maybe even another segment that goes underserved is the Muslim community. About 1.8 billion Muslims on the planet. They're underpenetrated when it comes to banking and with insurance, and we're thinking about how we might reimagine from the ground up takaful insurance to make it consistent with the principles of Sharia law. And it can be done because a company like Lemonade, which is based in the United States, is probably a takaful operator because it has the same kind of ethical principles.
And that's, the UN is very focused on what you had mentioned with the close to or a little over 1 billion people around the world that they think don't have a full digital identity. We think that these global initiatives really could benefit from our industry having a stronger voice of lessons that we've learned in some of the best practices, making sure that we don't end up with a multi-speed system and different pools around the world. So an important topic moving forward for us. We've integrated a few of the questions from the audience already, but there are some that we haven't. And one, I thought, Gurjeet, maybe I'd start with you. And the question was, AI and machine learning, can this also help transform the work of the regulator and the supervisor? Is this a place where we can automate and transform their involvement as well? And I know that's a place you've given some thought.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I spend about 20% of my time talking to regulators, across the world on the topic of AI and machine learning. I think overall regulators are super receptive. In all of our work and applications in financial services, we've had to interact with regulators and get their buy-in for our models. So I think overall, I found them to be a very receptive community. In particular, where I have the most experiences in the financial crimes era, and I think one of the major things where regulators can be very, very beneficial in this area is where they have most of the data because they get to see data from all sides of the equation, where every bank only sees their sliver of the data. I think the current mechanisms for giving data back to the banks are not great, and that's probably due to a lack of resources and sort of legal issues. I think that can certainly stand to be improved dramatically. I think also from an AI and machine learning perspective, since regulators see a much broader swath of data than anybody else, I think they themselves can actually begin to use machine learning to detect anomalies, for example, and start instigating or at least starting these transaction screening whenever it's appropriate. So I think there's a lot to be done there, and I think overall regulators are inclined towards thinking about these things. But it's still early days, though. I think it'll take a while.
And Rebecca, on that topic as well, any thoughts on reference data sets, feedback loops, data policy that could really improve the efficiency and effectiveness?
Well, first of all, just to thank you to going out and dealing with some of the explainability issues, because one of the things that we think is incredibly important is to be able to leverage technologies that we don't build ourselves, and having the participants and the designers go and speak to the regulators about the utility of some of these tools is incredibly powerful. I think regulators are using these tools. They're using them increasingly in surveillance for market misconduct, anomalies around insider trading risk. We're using them internally, and providing that data more efficiently through digital connectivity. These are really, really helpful, empowering tools that protect customers. And I think at the most fundamental level is being able to have consistency of approach across a variety of different jurisdictions, because you wouldn't want to see some regulators super enabled and not have the tide lift all boats. And again, as we look at this as a G20 priority, the utility, having the experts in the field, the designers of this technology, being able to bring it to a wide variety of different stakeholders, I think is incredibly powerful. But these technologies are not just about how do we maximize profit and efficiencies, but it's how do we protect the markets and financial stability.
And I think it goes beyond just the regulator. If you take it, escalate it even further to the entire public sector, public-private partnerships are going to be required to truly innovate in the future. Let me give you two great examples of progressive regulators that are thinking about this. Of course, MES has done a lot of work in terms of opening up the data sets they could use, not just for AML, but for other types of use cases. And we're still waiting for a government to start thinking about whether or not they'd open up the death registries, because it would be a natural place of cooperation between the private sector and the public sector to eliminate friction and improve customer experience. And I want to commend Japan as well around medical data. If you thought our industry was tough with data, just imagine healthcare and healthcare services. It's complex, there's a lot of privacy concerns, and yet the courage from entities of public sector to say, if we were to expose not just other types of data sets, but genomic and medical health pharmacy, we could obviously protect and anonymize the user's data, but maybe do research to figure out ways in which we could prevent risk in the future. And I really commend Japan and other jurisdictions who are taking that forward-looking approach, as Estonia is doing,
right,
to think about how they do things differently.
And rethinking, because data and alternative data sources might have really valuable new signals across industries. Some of that work of coordinating different industry regulatory frameworks, making sure that data can flow freely is essential work that we see just starting off. The Global Financial Innovation Network of regulators working together to try and create new environments. So hopefully these are just early examples and early days of the public sector and industry working together across the whole of the economy to make sure that we can have the products, services, and access that people want in the future. So we're basically out of time, but a couple quick speed round from the audience questions. One is, what are the advantages that incumbent banks have in this digital future? Anybody want to offer one or two there in a speed round? So again, 10-second answers.
They have the data.
I was going to say clients and trust.
See ya.
People.
Excellent.
Trust.
Excellent. That's a good one. And then what are we talked about some drivers of innovation. Any that we have left off or that we haven't really talked about yet? Just introduce something, put it in their brain so that they'll think about it later. Drivers of innovation.
Talent.
Okay.
The creativity.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for a fun and informative panel. We hope that you found this as exciting and interesting as I did.